You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about the 1980 horror movie, John Carpenter's The Fog. Here we go.
If I ever get an alias, I'm going to call myself Spivey Point. I feel like it's a great nom de plume.
That's where we're going to start right there. You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. Spivey Point himself, Pete Charbonneau, co-host extraordinaire. We're talking about 1980s John Carpenter's The Fog with Fan2Fan All-Star Michele Brittany. Michele, thanks for coming back on because we're digging into a movie that, for many people, when you look at John Carpenter's catalog, Halloween, understandably so, is one. But I think for many people now who have by default always had Halloween as number one with the bullet, The Thing and The Fog are not that far behind. Carpenter's catalog has gotten a rejuvenation, I think, as people have appreciated his impact on movies, certainly on our childhood and into modern horror. So movies like The Fog that may be considered and were underrated at the time, certainly not now. So, Michele, thank you for hopping on the episode to talk about The Fog.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm very excited to talk about The Fog. It's unlike probably a lot of other people who place Halloween or The Thing or Escape from New York as kind of their top tier John Carpenter. For me, I would say The Fog and Assault on Precinct 13 are probably my top tier John Carpenter films.
The light fades. Darkness falls. The air grows cold. The earth trembles. Pages turn. Something moves.
We're all cursed. All of us.
It's too late to run. It's too late to scream. The Fog is here. John Carpenter's The Fog. Rated R.
Do you remember the first time that you saw The Fog, Michele?
You know, I was thinking about that, and I probably saw it in the theater because I would have been old enough to maybe see it, although it wasn't R rating, but my dad used to take me to see R movies all the time.
Just good parenting right there.
So I probably saw it in the theater. I definitely loved ghost stories, and I would say this probably partly impacted my love for ghost stories, along with M.R. James, the English ghostwriter. Probably his writing was very influential for me to really love ghost stories. That's part of why The Fog is number one for me.
For the many things The Fog is, a ghost story it has to be up there. Pete, you've seen a lot of John Carpenter films. You love a lot of John Carpenter films. We talk a lot about John Carpenter on the podcast.
I don't recall that, Bernie. Have we talked about John Carpenter?
Sorry.
John Carpenter?
It's John. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Not Don. Don Carpenter.
Not Don?
Not Don. Yeah. He directed that other movie. But yes, John Carpenter, he of the Elvis TV movie starring Kurt Russell.
That's where I know him from.
That guy.
Yes,
that's where you know him from. I knew I'd connect all those dots. Do you remember when you saw The Fog for the first time?
I was pretty young. This would definitely have been a cable watch for me. Might have been around, Halloween time, because I feel like early 80s was get together with the cousins and, watch whatever horror was around. So I'm almost positive it would have been a cable watch for me. And immediately, how do you not get hooked from that opening? It just, you've got like the Carpenter score, the windswept dunes, John Houseman, who I believe was completely shit-faced during the filming of the scene, telling the story of the Elizabeth Dane to a group of kids.
11:55, almost midnight. Enough time for one more story. One more story before 12. Just to keep us warm.
Hooked right from the beginning, and it's one of my favorite. I don't know if it's probably not my top Carpenter film. I think that always will go to The Thing, but certainly top three with that Halloween and The Fog. Just absolutely love it.
having discussed this movie in the past, knowing that the poltergeist activity, especially in the beginning, was shot afterwards, where Carpenter was unhappy with the original cut, that he went back, and I think they've attributed a third of the film that we've enjoyed was basically reshoots that Carpenter had to go back and do because he was so unhappy with the first cut. Those are the things that are almost in some cases the most memorable to me, because those are the things that really cemented it as a ghost story, because it has so many things going for it, because it's so atmospheric, ghost pirates or revenants or whatever it is that they may be. But I think those elements with John Carpenter's score, those are the things that always just make it really memorable for me.
Plus the glowing fog just looks cool.
Yes, absolutely.
Again, you're watching this as a young person, as I was. It just works. It's perfect.
Yes. I wanted to revisit the fog thing because, Michelle, you said you saw this in theaters. And I do know that when it was released, so you have Afghan Embassy that makes a deal with Carpenter. And then this releases 1980, 1981. He fulfills that promise with Escape from New York. So he's made his two movies. This was supposed to be ready for Christmas 1979, but ends up coming out in February at a time that now when we think of film, we think of February as a time it's like a dump month where they put those small budget horror movies that are not ready for October, or the studio doesn't feel that confident about. That's when this was released. In some ways, creates the template for what we know now in February in horror films. But I did read when it was released in theaters, to bump up promotion, they had fog machines in some of the theaters. So I'm just wondering if you had any memory of that, Michelle, because I always think to myself, that is a hell of a gimmick. I mean, probably not something any fire marshal would sign off on in present day. But if you had any recollection of walking through a fog at all when you saw the fog.
I wish the hell that they did that. But I lived in a very small town. And so I went to the one theater that we had, and I think it was like $1 to go see the films. So there is no way they would have had a fog machine. I would have so remembered that.
Did you have a lasting memory that you recall from that first time seeing it in the theater? Was there something about the film, like a scene or a moment that really stuck with you that has made this your number one Carpenter film over the years?
It's kind of the culmination of everything about the film. Obviously I was pretty young when I first saw it. So then on subsequent viewings, when I would watch it, more things came into play. And I would say a big part is the nostalgia. I grew up in Northern California. I'm very familiar with the locale, the ocean locale where he shot some of it. It's Point Reyes Lighthouse, and I'm very familiar with that. Bodega Bay, where they had Stevie's little house out there on the pier. The radio station. I was friends with different DJs when I was young and in junior college. So all these kind of different factors come into play with my memory and my enjoyment. Obviously, the music. Again, going back to the core, it's the ghost story. And I would say probably the ship the first time when it comes up to the little fishing boat, and just all of the fog, and then just seeing hints of the revenants there. That, and then the very strong climactic scene where they're in the church and they're there for the Gold Cross and also for Father Milan. I think those were two very, very striking scenes that stick with me over the years, along with the nostalgia and the familiarity of the locale.
So, Bernie, what was your first recollection of seeing the fog?
I saw it when I went away to college. I've told the story a few times. I didn't really grow up watching a lot of horror movies as a kid, and we didn't get video store membership until much later in like the VHS era. So I was still catching up on Terminator and Highlander and some of these movies that I really wanted to see. So watching The Fog wasn't on the top of my list. But then when I went to college and I devoured the entire horror movie section, that's when I started to get a better understanding that filmmakers had a style. And It's the blessing and the curse. As much as access was amazing and I was able to binge these movies, for better or worse, or my freshman year roommate, another one, and like how many stacks of horror movies can you bring from the video store? And I'm like, I got to see them all. I got to go A through Z and check out all these films that I never had or was allowed to watch before. When you see that many John Carpenter films, subconsciously you start realizing that there's some things that thematically he's doing. And then, Michelle, like you mentioned, Assault on Precinct 13, when you step back and you see that perspective, you're like, there's some other stuff here. And when you start understanding his love of Howard Hawks and Westerns, got it. I can see where the DNA is here versus The Fog, where it just feels, and it felt to me that first time, I'm like, it just feels like a cool ghost story, something that you would have heard a camp counselor say at summer camp, to try to get all the kids kind of riled up and make them, not super scared, but just enough. And the fact that it starts that way and it leans into that with the atmosphere, it's not until more recent times rewatching it, and I've probably watched it a dozen times. I think every time I watch it now, the scene you were mentioning, Michelle, the first fishermen who are killed, I'm always impressed with that scene, and that the movie itself, and maybe this is to your father's benefit, there's not that much gore, so there's not much you would have seen that maybe would have been that traumatizing, Michelle, at that age. But there's some brutality in this movie, especially in that intro scene, in the way that the revenants kill the fishermen, both efficiently, but also, again, brutally. And I think that's always kind of stuck with me, is that they are not on screen for very long, but when they are, they get to business. And I think that's something about the film in general. Like, it has such a good clip. Like, it moves so quickly that by the time you're done, you wish you could get another 10 or 15 minutes. Carpenter has always talked about how, he's kind of more beloved now than he was then. And the quote that he always attributes to, I guess, a dinner he was having with Guillermo del Toro, who's gushing about his films. And, he's like, oh my God. And Carpenter replying, well, what the fuck good does that do me now? Like, I feel like that's such a Carpenter-ism to say, because I think the film moves at its clip. It's brutal, but it's efficient. I think allows it to be rewatched by people, and it doesn't feel old. It doesn't feel like it's aged. Still feels like just a good ghost story.
Yeah, and I think that that's really a good point, Bernie, because there is a sense of timelessness about it, because it is kind of steeped in kind of what I call every man or every woman kind of experience. We've all had, been woken up in the middle of the night because of a car alarm and heard a knock on the door late in the night, or we've met a stranger that we've really clicked with, maybe not gone to bed with them the first night, but, there's threads that are things that every person, I think, can pick up on and kind of identify with and pulled into it. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking was the fact that, okay, first off, I saw Alien in 1979, so I saw a lot of gore. So this was really mild in comparison.
Did you also see that in the theater, Michelle?
I did. Mm-hmm. My mother went to see that too. She didn't usually go to all the movies, but for whatever reason, she went to that one with my dad and I. And I'm just like, I think of that now and I'm like, holy cow, my mom wouldn't have liked that film. but she went to see it too. So, but I don't think she went to see The Fog. But the other thing that I think is unique about this, and I think what ties in nicely with Halloween, is the fact that we have lead female characters. We have a lot of female-driven story. Now, I read, some of the criticism is that there's lots of different little storylines going on. But I think that works to its advantage because, one, we get to see a lot of different female characters. We have Stevie, who is a DJ, but she also owns the radio station, happens to be in a lighthouse by herself. She's a single mom. She's raising her son. We know that there was a man in her life. Did they divorce? Did he die unexpectedly? We don't really have that information. We've got Elizabeth, who is passing through town that decides to hang out with Nick for a while. Then we've got the mayor of the town, who is also running around trying to put together the 100th anniversary. So it's very female driven, which was new for that time for a 1980 film. You know, we're coming off the heels of Sigourney Weaver, her Ripley character, where we're starting to see some female characters that are not just the final girl. They've been integral to the storytelling, which I think is actually kind of progressive for John Carpenter and these early films.
Just glad you brought that up, Michelle, because I think that's one of the unsung heroes, especially for early Carpenter. A lot of those hits is Deborah Hill. Certainly doesn't get enough credit, but when you think about Halloween, the teenagers sound like teenagers because of what Deborah Hill, her work. And I think with this one, I have to imagine as a writer and producer that I'd like to think she probably had, the thumb on the scale to feature strong women, like you mentioned, of different spectrums, whether they're a town leader or a woman who, by, any accounts could be like, oh, it's kind of scandalous. It's like, but Jamie Lee Curtis certainly is a very empowered woman throughout the whole film, regardless of, and it's also Tom Atkins. Like, if you could resist that, then you certainly have more power than I would. So there's something to be said there. But yeah, Stevie, of course.
Too, by the way, because I've met him.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yes, I have.
You saw the barrel chest in person, Michelle. Amazing.
I did, and he is quite the gentleman. So let me tell you, there. So I'm not surprised that you would not be able to resist.
Throw me every time, this guy right here. Yeah. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that's where, as much as The Fog is a ghost story and everything we've talked about, Deborah Hill's fingerprints are all over it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you said what I was going to bring up with Deborah Hill's influence on this, but I think the other thing that I really enjoy, and this carries over from Halloween, although you have more of a final girl in Halloween, but your quote unquote heroes of the film, or the protagonists, are, they do heroic things, but they're not like your typical, like, I'm coming to save the day type thing. Like Stevie Wayne does, tremendous things because she's trying to protect her son, and a very clear motivation to her actions. And she, of course, some of it's taken out of her hands because the curse is, somewhat lifted at the end, spoiler alert, but she's battling, she's doing heroic things. Jamie Lee Curtis is doing heroic things. A lot of the men in this, like Father Malone is, he's got his issues. Tom Atkins is, while competent, is kind of just, going through life type thing. You've got Charles Cyphers as the corded sweater, not creepy, weatherman that's, just waiting for Stevie Wayne to give him the time of day, which, spoiler alert, is never going to happen for multiple reasons.
This has got to be a joke. Someone's at the front door, sweetheart, playing a stupid joke. And whoever it is, they ain't gonna like finding me home.
Dan, stay away from the door! Dan!
Hello? Anybody here? Some asshole got drunk and started taking this 100-year-old business too seriously.
I think the female characters, Janet Leigh as the putting on the centennial, for Antonio Bay, the women have agency. They're doing heroic things, because they're kind of pressed into it, but they're not like your typical heroes. And I think that's another thing. We've talked about this before, Bernie. Carpenter can definitely have a very nihilistic point of view in a lot of his films. This one probably more of a straight up just wanted to tell like a good ghost story. But I like that the characters are flawed, but still relatable. And I think that helps really sell this movie, more than it might otherwise have in someone else's hands.
Yeah, I think Deborah Hill's contribution with the writing is very powerful here for women, because she did write believable women, and particularly at different stages of life for women. If I think back to the fact that, I saw this when I was quite young, I would have identified with the Elizabeth character, kind of carefree, artist type, has her whole life ahead of her. Oh, okay, so she's going to take a chance in this little town, and, she has to kind of deal with some revenants along the way. But, she's resilient, she's young. And then we get to the Adrienne Barbeau, Stevie, who is now, represents kind of the woman in her 30s, and she's got a family. She has agency, as you say. because she's not able to be there to save her son. And then you have the mayor who, she is going through, she's persevering, even though it's sort of played down. But we find out that her husband is one of the guys that was out on the ship that night.
Mm-hmm.
He's dead. They haven't found his body. So she's kind of like, further along. She has a sense of maturity. She's at a later period in her life where her feathers don't get as ruffled. She still has to be the mayor. She still has to put on that brave front. She still has to be the foundation, that corner stone for the town as they celebrate 100 years. And so it's really interesting. And
let's not forget poor Mrs. Kobritz, who just wanted to earn a little extra money babysitting. And,
exactly.
That's right.
Lesson number 1, don't answer the door after 10 o'clock.
That's right. Nothing good happens after 10.
Andy, I want you to go to your room.
I think I should stay.
Right now. Right now.
Yes.
Right now. Go to your room.
I want to see who it is.
No.
Can't I stay for 2 more seconds? Okay, I'm going.
The one female character we didn't talk about is Sandy, played by Nancy Loomis. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that I'm thinking about now, and again, this is the good thing about watching these movies with different perspectives, you don't get too deep into the characterization. They don't dig deep as much as you would want, but it doesn't ever also feel, at least to me, like the characters are ever too tropey, where anyone does something too frustrating or only actions that would take place in a horror or slasher type movie. Even in someone like Sandy's character, she's snarky, and she certainly gives Janet Leigh some of the business because, she's just the teenager / assistant on this big day where I'm sure they've been planning it for maybe years. This supernatural event happens that throws off all of their planning as, citizens and, some of their close ones are potentially dead. And meanwhile, Sandy could turn out to be just this annoying young woman who turns out to be just a trope, but opposite. It doesn't do that. And I think that happens with a lot of the characters that are not overly explored, but never get to a place where you lose interest in them. If anything, it's just maybe Father Malone at best, who kind of goes into like the drunk priest type of character. But again, there's not that much exploration done, so I don't want to dock Carpenter any points.
That's a good point about Sandy. And I had forgotten about how she kind of is a good juxtaposition to Elizabeth. Like there's, when
totally.
you go, you do the right, you do air quotes, the right thing and go to college and you develop a career, or you take the year off and decide to, hitchhike up the coast or something like that. You get kind of a nice juxtaposition there.
That's a good point. Sandy has a 401k. Elizabeth does not.
But you also, that if The Fog was made today, and we don't need to discuss the remake that came out in the 2000s because I don't remember it and it was horrible. If you were to try to make this story today, or even like later on in the 80s, that Sandy character would have been, to your point, Bernie, probably would have been more of a trope. Yes. It would have been someone that you're almost kind of like rooting for to get killed at some point, because they would have been played as like just like the annoying, like I'm just here to crack a joke and just be that person. And unfortunately, that's kind of what a lot of horror turned into as the 80s went on, as we've talked about as well. Again, the benefit of when it came out, when it did, before a lot of those stereotypes of horror characters and scenes really took hold, you had someone, again, like that. Someone's a little more grounded. It's a little more believable. They're not, maybe not a huge depth of character, but they seem to be more one note, even given the little bit of screen time and dialogue that they have.
That is something you mentioned, Pete, especially in slashers that are arguably more popular than The Fog that came out in the 80s, where it feels like they hung their plots on plots that we all recognize and kind of diluted what horror could be and made it more popcorn friendly, but at times just didn't give us what movies like The Fog gave us. Some of that maybe also lends to the fact that the root of the evil in this is really something that these characters are. It's not like in Halloween, where if you can stay away from Michael Myers, like if you just don't get in Michael Myers' way, then maybe you have a chance of him not killing you. Or if you're just in the town adjacent, you're kind of safe. Versus this one, this is like an evil that exists in the land. That's like part of literally the DNA of these people, presuming that you couldn't just drive away from Antonio Bay, go to like Vegas or something else and be like, they'll never find me. Because my guess is, on this evening, these revenants will try to get their pound of flesh. And these people, because they're just descendants, it's not like they can do anything to really get out of it. Only thing they can do is kind of survive. But it's not like they brought it on. They didn't create the evil. They weren't reckless in any way. Their descendants were, and now they're paying the price for it. I mean, I think that's not something that Carpenter is really, he's not biting into that, but there's some stuff there that's kind of interesting. Maybe there was something there. These people didn't do anything bad. They didn't commit a sin. Their forefathers did, but they got to pay for it.
Yeah. Well, you're touching on a question that I was going to throw out to both of you. Basically the mythos that's established in this movie by Carpenter with the revenants and the ghost story and the lore of the Elizabeth Dane. Again, like he gives you just enough information, but it leaves enough kind of to your imagination to kind of fill in some blanks. But I was curious what you both thought about, the mythos that's introduced in this film, with anything from like, the gold coin washing up on the beach and the water leaking out of the ship and things like that. Like what was your take on all of that?
I actually like those aspects when the little boy sees the coin on the rock and he goes to try to get it, and then it becomes the piece of wood. That's kind of magical. And then later, Nick talks about how when he was a little boy, his dad brought a coin back and, he goes to show it and it's not in his pocket anymore. I thought those were kind of really interesting points. And honestly, I did not make the connection until I was reading that. I think in the novelization, there's more connection with the people that died were actually descendants that had basically caused the downfall of Blake and his group, that there were the 6 people. But that totally makes sense, because you would have had the 3 guys on the boat who would have been fishermen, obviously Nick. So he's part of one of those, descendants. So obviously he's kind of marked, And then when I started thinking of that, I'm like, oh, that's really clever. Yeah, maybe it would have been nice if he leaned a little bit more into that in the film. But I like the mythos, and I thought that it worked, and it gives you something to think about. I know after I watched it Sunday, I was still thinking about it and thinking all the different things that happened and how the characters connected and how the action progressed and how well the film held up with kind of a simple story.
Yeah, I think that's where like the mythos is interesting, because Carpenter sets up all the rules, but he also plays by the rules. The movie seems to reveal something new every time. You mentioned the kid finds the coin, but Tom Atkins' character talks about it. So it's like it happened before and it's happened again. So the movie is setting up the rules, but it's not violating them, which is why I think from a narrative standpoint, while he's not delineating everything and giving you like this person's last name is this person's last name, and then I'm going to show you a picture of them. He's not doing that. It's not as obvious, but I think that's where some of that ambiguity helps the movie lean more into vibe than it maybe necessarily leans into detail, which is maybe one of its failings. And I think that's where Carpenter succeeds in this. I give you enough rules and enough supernatural sprinkles, and as long as I don't violate the rules, you know that the revenants are going to knock on the door and they're going to make their way in. Like all the procedural stuff is there. It's not like they suddenly pop up if you don't open the door. Like there's certain functional speed bumps that he's thrown in the way to be like, as a viewer, well, they didn't do it there. So like Stevie is safe in the house, right? And as long as she's in there in the lighthouse, she should be okay until she's not. And same with our main character. So I think that's where he does a good job of, staying within the mythos. And in some ways, maybe that's where he had more runway to explore it. But what about you, Pete? What did you think?
Like I said, I enjoyed it. Like, the scene where Stevie's playing like the bumper commercials ahead of her shift, and then all of a sudden you've got, I think it was Blake's voice comes in over it.
The smooth sound. Fabulous 1340 KAB. From top of the world, fabulous 1340 KAB, Antonio Bay, California. 46.
Something that one lives with like an albatross around the neck. No more like a millstone. A plumbing stone, by God. Damn them all.
10. Every hour, on the hour. KAB News and Weather.
A lot of that is this actually happening? Is it a hallucination? Like, it's okay because there's no real right or wrong answer, but I think it establishes that atmosphere that you're talking about. I think the only, and this is a minor quibble because you just kind of go with it. The only time I think Carpenter really kind of violates the rules that he sets up, and I think this was one of the reshoots that you talked about earlier, Bernie, was after they go out and they find the fishing boat and they bring back the one body that has like the jump scare, and it's in the morgue, and then it kind of gets reanimated and starts walking towards Jamie Lee Curtis and has like the scalpel. Like, that was the one thing I was just kind of like, that doesn't really make sense. But I think that might have been more a product of Carpenter wanting to have like an extra scare in there. What else can we do? Let's film this extra scene. But I think in terms of the rules that he's establishing, I don't know, like animating like the dead corpse, is that I guess it's possible. I mean, like the fog literally like short circuits like the fishing trawler and things like that. So I think that he keeps the rules kind of nebulous enough that you just go with it. But that was the only one at the time I was just kind of like, does that make sense? But I'm like, not really. But it was a cool, scary moment. So
that's a good point you brought up with the morgue scene, because I am wondering if you're in the edit room and you're getting to a place, and again, you're talking to someone like John Carpenter, who, now in hindsight, horror master, but still a filmmaker at that time, a young filmmaker. And is he just understanding, you know what, I'm getting to a place where I need something to happen. And maybe, like you said, this kind of violates a little bit of the rules. Is that corpse possessed by one of the revenants? The fact that it's actually taking on a weapon, like it's not a zombie, but it's kind of Gollum-like because it seems to
like
be
a marionette
somewhat
type thing.
Exactly. Like there's all those rules, but I think that's, to your point, Pete, it's nebulous enough. But maybe the Occam's razor to this is just like, you know what? There were 5 minutes in a scene without a scare. And he's like at the 2-minute and 32-second mark of that 5-minute scene. I need kids to jump off their seats, and I'm going to figure it out somehow. And if they're not in the water, it'll happen in the morgue. This makes sense.
Well, I think what he also does, too, is he plays with conventions a little bit where you get trained to, like, daytime is, like, safe. You're supposed to be safe. But he's got things happening during the daytime, that being one scene included, where it kind of throws that rule out the window of like, well, yes, the fog will roll in at night, and that's when the danger really hits. But there's still some shit going down during the day. So when you think like you're seeing a scene where the sun is out and it's bright and they're just kind of trying to figure out the mystery of what's going on, then nothing really bad is going to happen. Carpenter still kind of be like, oh, no, actually something bad could happen, and I'm going to throw this little curveball at you.
I feel like that little scene could have gone away and wouldn't have taken anything away from the film, because we do find out when Stevie's listening to the bumpers and the board changes to three more die, or whatever the specific statement is. So that really cues in the audience what the heck has to happen. But it also sets up the fact that, if we're counting, we get 5 when Father Malone lets go of the cross because Nick pulls him away. And we're like, oh, well, are they going to be satisfied with 5? And that's when we get that extra little stuff at the end, that no, they weren't satisfied with 5. They needed a 6.
just you talking about that end scene, Michelle, like it's ingrained in my brain forever. Not just the visual, but the sound effect of like the sword, and then immediately cutting into like the closing theme with like that like little percussion beat, like.
It has like a Tubular Bells kind of sound to it every time.
That is so ingrained in my head and will be until the day that I die. Yep. And thanks, John Carpenter, for doing that. I think I may have mentioned this anecdote on another episode at some point. Michelle, when you were saying that you read the novelization, I want to say at some point that I did too. I took it out of the library, but there was a time I was visiting my grandparents in Florida, and we went to, I think it was like a used bookstore. And, I was a voracious reader back then, and I'm like going through like the paperbacks, and I came across The Fog, but it didn't have the movie poster cover or anything like that. The cover was yellow, and the font was not the same. And I'm like, I don't know, it says The Fog. I'm like,
did you read James Herbert's The Fog?
It was about like people that become like sexually like the fog causes them to do like all these like crazy sex acts or something like that. Like,
I think that might have been the James Herbert.
I'd have to double check.
That's set in England. Is that the one?
Maybe. I was so young, but I somehow convinced my parents to let me get the book, because I still, even after reading the back, I'm like, this doesn't sound like the movie. I'm like, but it's called The Fog. So, and I started reading it, and I'm like, oh no, this isn't about the movie at all. I think my parents returned the book for me. So like, you're a little too young to be reading about this. This is a little.
I think that might be the one. I was living over in England at the time, and I had never heard of James Herbert. And he wrote several horror books. And The Fog was one of them, and I thought it was The Fog.
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was James Herbert, because I just looked it up, and there is the cover.
There's the cover. There it is.
That I remember.
Yeah. I was in the same camp as you, Pete. I thought I was reading the novelization, and boy, did I find out I was not. I did stick with it, though. I was a little older than you.
To both of your surprises, that movie was directed by Don Carpenter. It is Don Carpenter's The Fog.
Now, I did meet John Carpenter, and I actually met a few people from the Fog. Because,
Carpenter, you mentioned Atkins as well. You got those two.
Yes, and then the sweater-wearing Charles Cypher. I met Nancy Loomis. I met Tom Atkins, and I think Adrienne Barbeau. I'm not sure, but then I had John Carpenter sign my copy of The Fog.
I love that he established like his own little brand like in those early 80s, because it was like the same small group of people. It's Deborah Hill, it's Dean Cundy doing the cinematography. Like, you go see that Carpenter movie, like you're gonna like, it looks like a John Carpenter film. Tom Atkins, Jamie Lee Curtis, Charles Cyphers, like all these people that keep getting used throughout. And then
and George, the one fisherman guy, George.
Yeah, George Buck Flower.
That's right.
They Live.
That's right.
Yeah,
and then Tommy Wallace. That's his character's name. So
right, yeah, and using the name, like, yeah, because isn't Tom Atkins' character Nick Castle in The Fog?
There you go. That's right.
The guy who played Michael Myers in the original. Like, he's weaving in all this stuff, and like the character names, like Loomis, Nancy Loomis, like it's all like in there. And so, even though I don't remember in what order that I saw a lot of his early films, I'm sure I probably saw Halloween first, but like between that, The Thing, The Fog, all that. You just knew that you were in his world. I think that's just like, way ahead of like when branding was like paramount to all that stuff. Like, he was doing it and did it in like I don't know if it was a subtle or not so subtle way, but like he was just like upfront about it, and like it pays off. It's kind of magical.
Hey, there's something in talking about branding. There's something in knowing the power of putting your name before a film, taking a lot of ownership. There's a confidence in there, I'm sure, a lot of ego, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, and also know that there's also a way where he's like, this movie, with the contributions of many people, for better or worse, will have my name. And if people enjoy it, hopefully they'll want more of the same, and I will try to give them that. But if they don't enjoy it, then we'll remember my name as well. So there's something to be said about that. I think that's John Carpenter's The Fog. Thank you, guys. This was a good one.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to our conversation when we talk about Christine.
And Prince of Darkness, too.
and Prince of Darkness.